In everyday life, we see people going to and fro, and people are going about their everyday lives. And we get into our cars and we drive somewhere, and there's other people on the road. They're going someplace too. And each one of them have different destinations, and they all seem intent on getting wherever it is that they're going. Some are in a terrible hurry. Some are pretty aimlessly driving along very slowly. The hurry ones will tailgate your car and drive very close behind you. And others are like Mr. Magoo. They're somewhat oblivious to the world around them. We can go to a grocery store and we can see that everybody's selecting their items to purchase. And yet, I've never seen anybody in the checkout line with exactly the same choices that they're making. They're all having different combinations. And I wonder about that. Has anybody ever bought this combination that I'm doing? And because they all look so very different. On holidays such as Thanksgiving, some people share a meal with family or friends. Others might go out to dinner together. Some will stay at home, having no one to share the day. People have a variety of lives, and some are together, some are friendly, some are apart, some are lonely. The same thing is true among students. And it was decades ago when I taught a junior high school social studies class, actually several sections. There were 30 students in each of these seventh graders in each class. And I recall, even these many years later, that one particular 12-year-old boy was very difficult. He was out of his seat, he was talking when he shouldn't, just being obnoxious, and it was hard to give instructions, hard to go through it, and I knew I had to be gracious. And so he got another chance, and then another chance, and finally I called him out to the hall privately, and I explained that after giving him these chances, he, hasn't changed his behavior. I would have to isolate him so that the rest of the class could get on with the lesson. And then a remarkable thing happened. He looked at me in horror, just terrible fear, and he said, "No, I'll do anything. I'll do anything. Don't put me out in the hall or send me to the principal's office." And I said, "Well, that was a choice you make with your behavior." And he said, "No, I beg of you, I will do anything so that this doesn't happen. I will sit quiet. I will be in the corner. I won't look at anybody." He made all these promises that he hadn't been doing all along. And I thought, what kind of turnaround is this? And I said, "Why should I believe you now?" And he said, "If you send me to the principal's office to isolation," he said, "the principal will call my mother, and she will pick me up and take me home, and I will get a beating. Then when her boyfriend gets home from work, I will get another beating. Then my mother will call my father, and they were estranged, and he will give me a beating. I will do anything to avoid that. So what do you want me to do?" And to his credit, he came in the room, he acted like the model student, he learned where the limits were, and it was an amazing experience for me because I was just looking at the group as all students who were in the ordinary course of life. I wasn't thinking about the lives of the students behind the one that came into the classroom. I didn't think about their home life, what the world was like somewhere else. It was an amazing experience. It was really eye-opening that everybody has living a life that we know nothing about. There are people, they're driving, they're walking, and their lives are their lives, and we don't know what it's like to be in their shoes. Well, I kept this boy's story in mind now for over 40 years, that this fellow had a life, just as we all do, that no one knows anything about. Well, today's subject I want to talk about is healing a broken heart, because in all of our lives, we know somebody who's had a heavy amount of grief, and usually a sudden amount of grief, and we can compare that, but we don't know what it is because many people have those grievous situations, and we're oblivious to it. Just like I was oblivious to the little boy's life, we don't know what other people's lives are like unless we're very close to them. So I want to go over this healing a broken heart today. Now, we do know in Proverbs 15:13 that a merry heart makes a cheerful countenance. So if somebody's smiling and happy and participating in things, you won't know what's behind them. And we see this in many comedians, that they try to overcome a bit of sadness with comedy. And we see this merry heart, and if you're feeling happy, you're generally going to share it, you're going to spread it, people are going to know that you are feeling good about something. But notice the last half of verse of Proverbs 15:13. But by sorrow of the heart, the spirit is broken. You know, feeling very weak on the inside, very worthless. You're dragged down if the spirit is broken by the sorrow of the heart. So if there's something that happens that causes great sadness, then you feel powerless to do that. Now we have in Psalm 38, in fact, I'm going to go over some of Psalm 38 today. A psalm that's a psalm of David. I am feeble and severely broken. I groan because of the turmoil of my heart. Well, David, it's presumed that David wrote this psalm, chapter 38, after the matter of Uriah and Bathsheba. And we can also refer to Psalm 32 and Psalm 51, but I'm just going to go to Psalm 38 at this time. And it's really the story of how he felt, because he felt really down. And we can read the story in 2 Samuel 11, and we can go through some of that. I'm not going to go through all of it. Many of us know that, but I will want to call attention to a few of the points on the outline. That David made a mistake. And that was a very serious mistake. And then he compounded the mistake in 2 Samuel 11. And it tells about that time when David got caught up with Bathsheba and committed adultery and then arranged for the death of her husband Uriah. The Bathsheba got pregnant as a result of that adultery. David tried to cover that up. It didn't work out. The cover-up didn't work out. And so David tried to clean things up. Could anybody else tell on the outside? Probably a few people close knew it, but for the most part, people didn't know. And he went on about his business. And then Nathan the prophet, if we read about it in 2 Samuel 12. 2 Samuel 12, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. And he, meaning the prophet, came to David and said, there were two men in a city, one rich and the other poor. And Nathan went through and explained how the poor man lost his lamb to the rich man. The rich man just took it. And it was really a story that made David indignant. He could see the problem in someone else, and he didn't see it in himself. And so then we go to 2 Samuel 12 and verse 13. And after the story was done, David realized when Nathan said this to him, when Nathan said, you are the man, you are the one that's guilty here of taking the lamb, because David pronounced a terrible penalty on the rich man who stole from the poor man. And what did David say then in 2 Samuel 12:13? I have sinned against the Lord. There is a sudden impact on his life. He recognized what the problem was. So now we're going to look at the Psalms. If we take a look at the Psalms that David wrote, how isolated he felt when he realized that he had arranged for the adultery, had gotten a married woman pregnant, had then arranged to try to cover it up through you might say, the framing, even getting the husband drunk, as it were, and then sending and arranging for his commander to have Uriah killed. And others were killed too. It wasn't just Uriah. There were others that were done. And it was a devastating thing. And it was found out. And now he had to face the consequences. And of course, it's hard to feel sorry for anybody who does that whole list of things. And yet David then had that in his mind, how devastated he was when the full reality came that he had done these things. And how did he look on himself? Well, we can take a look at Psalm 69 in verse 20. In Psalm 69 in verse 20, he writes, "Reproach has broken my heart. I am full of heaviness. I looked for someone to take pity, but there was none. And for comforters, I found none." Well, who is going to feel sorry for him? Look at the things that he had done, and the list of and the people that were hurt, lives that were changed, some terminated. So he was devastated, not just for them, but for himself, but for them as well. And he called attention to this, and he felt very heavy because of that, and said his heart was broken. And not only that, he was isolated to the point that he knew no one was going to have pity on him. This was it. He said there wasn't anybody to give him comfort because he knew what he had done. Let's take a look at what happens to everyone in life as when there is a sudden loss or a loss. We have what we call the stages of the grief cycle. And the first stage, of course, we all have a certain level of normal functioning. And then something bad happens, something that's devastating, a loss of some kind. And first off, we're in shock or denial. No, it can't be. No, say it isn't so. And when we do that, then it's characterized by avoidance and confusion. We will maybe a little fear. What's going on here? I don't understand. Maybe we're kind of numb, or we start blaming ourselves. How could this be? Maybe if only I could have been there in time, or only I would have done this. And then in the grief cycle, it descends into anger. And this anger is as a result of frustration, maybe anxiety, irritation. Maybe we're embarrassed or shamed. This whole anger flows out. First denial, and then the anger. And then we have depression and detachment. This is the low point, and many people feel this particular low point. And I know when I went through the counseling sequence at university years ago, there's a lot of people that hit this stage, the depression and detachment, and they stay there. They call it the trough. They stay in this bottom. They just kind of skid along. It's like skipping stones on the lake. They're just always getting wet, always skipping the stones. But they feel overwhelmed. They have the blahs. They have a lack of energy. They feel helpless. They're not able to feel as though they're able to do anything. And then you'll notice this isn't on this slide. It isn't a perfect curve. You notice there are loops in it. It was many years ago. Well, it was over 25 years ago. I started with divorce counseling to help other people. And I found that some people were stuck in the first stage of the grief cycle. They were continually in shock and denial. Others were stuck in the angry mode. They couldn't get out of it. Yet others were stuck in the depression mode, and they were somewhat detached, walking around numb, and they couldn't shake that. Some bounced back and forth between one place and another, and they weren't climbing out of it. But when they do climb out, then they begin the dialogue or bargaining. Well, I'll tell you what, and people often do this. God, if you will do this for me, I will do this for you. Sound like a good plan, right? Kind of a something of this for something of that. I think the Latin term is quid pro quo. I'll give you something here if you give me something there. We go through the bargaining. Or we'll bargain maybe with others in our lives. How about this or how about that? And now we're starting to reach out a little bit, and we're starting to dialogue. We're reaching out a little bit to others. We're opening up from the depression or the detachment. And we find some meaning or value in what's happening. What am I supposed to learn from this? Why did I go through this? What's the purpose or the meaning of this particular loss? Why am I stuck in this grief cycle? Now, to be fair, people can go through these stages. They can be stuck in one stage for a month, a day, a week, a month, a year, or they can go through every stage in one day and then start over the next day. It's a difficult path to get their way through. And finally, we have the stage called acceptance. This is where exploring options, they put a new plan in place. How am I going to live life? I've got to get past this. And they've made peace with themselves. And that is then their return to a meaningful life. Because now they feel empowered. I'm finally getting over this. I've got some security, some self-esteem back. I feel a little purpose of life, some sense of meaning. So we have these stages of grief, and we all go through them. Because it isn't always actual loss, it's perceived loss when we lose something that's dear to us. But what happens when it's extremely sudden? When this happens very sudden, we have what we call broken heart syndrome. When this sudden thing happens. Now, this is a physical event, and we can look at this as a temporary heart failure after this event. It's a temporary weakening of the muscular portion of the heart. Now, stress, and there's a Japanese name for this, takatsubo, and this particular physical symptom is where the heart has a bulging of the left ventricle, where part of the heart actually enlarges, so it feels painful. Now, I've been through this, perhaps some of you have, and I've tried to describe it as like pulling a golf ball through a garden hose. You know, there's kind of this big old lump that somehow it's trying to get through that with the bulging of that part of the heart. Now, the heart physically changes shape, and they can see this when they take an MRI or an X-ray, that the heart takes on a rounded shape with a narrow neck, sort of like a bottle. And they call it this Takatsubo cardiomyopathy because it represents, and it was identified first in Japan, it represents a Japanese lobster or octopus trap where they crawl in, but then they can't get out. And so this particular condition generally lasts or can be healed up because it's theoretically temporary. It takes about 2 months to heal up. Historically, it happens after the grief from a death from a loved one. Some people get it from fear of public speaking. It's the number one fear of adult males in North America. The fear of public speaking is greater than the fear of death in most men, whether they realize it or not. Perhaps there's a sudden financial reversal. Some people get it with an argument with a spouse or other relationship disagreements. They felt betrayed. Maybe there's other medical issues that could give a physical stressor to the body. And you can look up this broken heart syndrome. I mean, it's all over. Whether you look at it on the, I've just pulled it up from the medicaldictionary.com, and was able to find that. We'll get there. Come on. In Psalm 34, verses 17 through 19, we hear what God says about the broken heart. The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart and saves such as have a contrite spirit. Well, that's an interesting thought, that the Lord is near to those who have a broken heart. And then this contrite spirit. Well, let's take a look at what this contrite spirit is. We're going to see that in a moment. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. It happens to everyone that there is going to be somewhere in our lives, maybe more than once, maybe more than twice, maybe 20 times, depending upon the situation in your life. But many are the afflictions, but the Lord delivers them. The word contrite, I looked this one up on Webster's Revised Unabridged Dictionary. It said, because the Lord is with those who have a contrite spirit, it means broken down with grief and penitence. deeply sorrowful for the sin because it's displeasing to God, humbly and thoroughly penitent. Does this sound like King David when he said, I have sinned against the Lord? He then had the contrite spirit. He then was broken down with grief, realizing the horror of what he was involved with and what he had done. So God says he'll be with those who have a contrite spirit. It doesn't just say those who are sorry that they got caught. It's those who are honestly humble before God and thoroughly penitent, as the word is the definition of contrite. So there's a precondition for us for healing is to have that penitent or repentant attitude before God. So what do we know? We know that grief for sudden loss is normal. We know that a broken heart over sudden loss is possible. We know that broken hearts can heal. As they say, it takes about 60 days on average for a broken heart, for the heart to resume its normal size and to start functioning as it is. And then we also know, because of this process, that there's something we can do to aid the healing process. Now, there's things that we can do in 3 different categories. And the first category, of course, is when people have asked me, what should I do? And some of these are church people, some of these are not. And I say, you need to take care of your body. God gave you a body to haul your brain around. If you don't take care of your body, can't take care of your brain, you can't think straight. So you've got to take care of your bodies. Now, when I put the word physical diet, I'm talking about what we eat, what we do, how we move around. And there's really 2 things that we have to look at: what we should avoid and what we should acquire. Well, we need to avoid things that are bad for us and acquire things that are good for us. That seems pretty obvious, right? There was a time in my earlier life when I went through a severe distress, and I decided I had to take better care of myself physically. So I began walking. First, it was the length of the driveway, 600 feet. And after I had that walking every day, then I worked it up to 1.5 miles. 3/4 of a mile one way, 3/4 of a mile back. And pretty soon I had myself in order where my muscles were acclimated to this regular running. Then I started running. And I was much younger then than I am now. So I found that after a while I could run the entire 1.5 miles, increasing a little bit each week until I could do that. And of course, everybody is a little different, but my goal was to restore my body, heart, and mind to peak conditioning to overcome the broken heart. And of course, as we know, everybody is different and you have different circumstances. But when we look at Proverbs 17:22, as we read, a merry heart does good like medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones. So it feels good to feel good, and it feels bad to feel bad. And so the next healing step is not just what we eat and what exercise we have, but there's a mental diet. And just like physically what we avoid and what we acquire, we avoid certain things for our mental diet and we acquire certain things to help us. Now, in that time in my life, over 25 years ago, I couldn't watch a movie or a television show that was a drama. It just wouldn't work. It was too much grief and it was too emotionally distressful. Instead, I decided to only watch uplifting or exciting or adventurous movies. I could go down to the local video store at that time. The internet wasn't very strong then. And I could get 39 cents a day for some videos. So I could get 3 movies for 3 days. And I would, for less than $1.20, I could do that. And I made sure to never watch the dramas, the ones that were cut. Otherwise, I'd need a 5-gallon bucket full of tears to fill that up. No, I wasn't going to be doing that. That's not how I was going to heal, by like picking off the scab, not doing that over and over again. So I only watched the uplifting ones, the exciting ones, for healing of the mind, because healing of the mind is an important partner for healing the body. They go together. The body hauls the brain around, and the brain gives direction for the body and provides a temple for the Holy Spirit. In 2 Timothy 1:7, we read in 2 Timothy 1:7, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." This is a gift from God. We want that sound mind, but we have to not obstruct it. We have to let that occur in our lives by avoiding the things to put in our brain that we shouldn't put in, and then acquiring the things that we want to put in to our brain. And you already know the things that you should put in there, and you already know the things that you should avoid. So there's no reason to go over that list. But we need to make that list and check it, our lives, against that list in order to secure what God says is a sound mind. Now, in Proverbs 17:22, we read that a merry heart does good. And there was a fellow many years ago that was a television personality, and he got cancer. And he wrote a book because what he did is he watched humor videos every day, all day, for a year. He laughed all day for a year. This wasn't a church-going man. This was a television personality. But his idea was that if he laughed enough, he would produce enough good endorphins, the hormones in his system, that it would overcome the cancer cells. And it worked. It took about a year. So what do we read here in Proverbs 17:22? A merry heart does good like medicine. And he did. That laughter, that joy was very good. He didn't stay at the bottom of the grief cycle. He decided to make a plan in order to lift himself up. So this mental diet is avoiding the wrong things, acquiring the right things. There is one thing that stops people, and that is the word fear. The word fear is a common obstacle for most of us. We're afraid of the known. We're afraid of the known. We're also afraid of the unknown. Guess what we're afraid of even more? Now, I don't want to go sit on a hot stove. That's the known, right? But what if you put a dark room and said there's something bad in there? It's the unknown that caused people to have a lot of internal fear. The best explanation of this, because God says, that perfect love casts out fear, is much of the fear that people have is in not facing reality because they see something that's not there. Zig Ziglar said, fear is an acronym, FEAR, false evidence appearing real. We think it's going to be worse than what it really is. So we just get started to do something, to rebuild our lives. And then the false evidence melts away. It's not really there because we're replacing in our lives something that we should do. And of course, 1 John 8:14. There's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Because fear involves torment, but he who fears has not been made perfect in love. Now, this always confused me. How in the world is love going to cast out fear? I've got the wolf at the door. I've got this problem and I've got that problem. And they're all bearing down on me. And you're telling me to be loving. How very annoying is that? And yet, where's our strength? Where's our strength? And we're going to keep going on this one. We're going to come back to this as to how to get rid of that fear by substituting or putting in place of it love. So we have these healing steps. The healing steps, what we do with our physical diet, meaning what we eat and how we move around, our mental diet, what we take in and what we avoid, and then there's our spiritual diet. And in each of these, we have avoidance versus acquisition. Some things to avoid and some things that we should do. Well, if we take a look at our spiritual diet, the easiest one to pull out that we all know, and we all know this verse, is James 4:7. Stay close to God. In James 4:7, therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. It's our job first to stay close to God. That is a healing step in the spiritual diet. Otherwise, it's, well, God doesn't know. He's not looking. I'm not close to him anyway, kind of thing. Because it's what can we get away with when God's not looking? And it somehow escapes our minds that God is looking. So if we stay close to God, it will keep it in the forefront of our mind that our submission to God is a foundational step in our spiritual diet. And what do? You'll notice it says, draw near to God, he will be near to you. Then it says, cleanse your hands. What is that? Those are your actions. That's what happens. When you're close to God, you're paying attention. If you're out working on the car and you come into the house to eat your meal, what do? You wash your hands. You cleanse your hands from the activities that you were involved in so that you can be prepared for the meal. He's telling us right here in James 4:7, cleanse your hands, clean up your act, clean up our activities that we are. And this time of year before Passover, that's what we're expected to do. We're expected to use these healing steps in our spiritual diet, and that should affect us into what we do. Notice it says, cleanse your hands, you sinners. I'd ask for a show of hands on how many people who are not sinners here, but I don't think we'd see many hands. It says, purify your hearts. You're not doing it just because you should not sin. You're doing it because in your heart, you know it's the right thing to do. We have to be away from what it says here, double-minded. We can't go both ways. We can't have God and mammon at the same time. We have to make that decision. So first of all, the first point on healing steps for a spiritual diet is to stay close to God. Secondly, in our spiritual diet, we need to have personal goals. Personal goals, most of us will bring Matthew 6:33 to mind. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Our first priority, because we're close to God, is now seeking the kingdom of God. This is what God has in store for us. This is a responsible and a reasonable goal. Then the blessings will flow if we're staying close to God and have the appropriate goal. Of course, for all these things to be added to you, I do want to turn over to 1 Peter 3:8. In 1 Peter 3:8, I don't have it up on the screen. Finally, all of you, be of one mind, have compassion one for another, love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous. If we're seeking God, keeping God close to us, and his righteousness, that's what's going to flow forth from us, is that we're going to have compassion for one another, have love for one another, be tender-hearted, and be courteous. And the third step here on the healing step for our spiritual diet is to be thankful for what we have. In Psalm 69, verses 29 and 30, again the psalmist writes, but I am poor and sorrowful. Does it sound like somebody who's repentant? Who's feeling poor? Who's feeling sorrowful? What does it say? Let your salvation, O God, set me on high. I will praise the name of God with a song and will magnify him with thanksgiving. Ever turn on the radio and a song you really like comes on? And it has that lively, peppy approach that just picks up your day, picks up your life. This is what we're talking about here. God is talking about that's the kind of enthusiasm, that's the kind of energy that will help with spiritual healing, is praising the name of God with a song. We do that each week with our hymns. And then what does it say? Magnify him with thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is a remarkable medicine. It's an absolute remarkable pill, as it were, if we were to take something every day and we didn't do anything else and we were thankful in the morning, all day, and all night, our lives would change. Just this alone would be close, and that would help us to draw closer to God and set our priorities. But being thankful for what we have. Recently, I saw a a YouTube video about a guy complaining about his car because his sports car was had a couple of years old on it. And the next guy was envying his car because he had a regular sedan. And the next guy was envying the regular sedan because he had a jalopy. And the next one was envying the jalopy because at least he had a car and he was just driving in the rain in a motorcycle. And the next guy wished he had a motorcycle because he was tired of biking 10 miles a day. And the guy, the one on the motorcycle, the next one along, was happy because wished he could have the bicycle because he could only walk and because he couldn't afford the rest. And the guy that was walking then was looked on enviously by the one who was in a wheelchair. And the one in the wheelchair was envious of the one who could walk. And then there was the one who couldn't even get into the wheelchair. And that was the one who was the most thankful of all for the breath of life, for the opportunities that he had before him, and so forth. So this entire process as being thankful for what we have instead of disappointing for what we don't have. Then the next step on our spiritual diet, on the healing steps, is to help others reach their spiritual goals. In 1 Peter 3:8, we read, "Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion one for another, love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous." This is showing the fruit of what we do. We are stepping outside of ourselves, we're growing beyond ourselves, and we're helping others. Because when we help others, we are really getting the most help ourselves. And Peter writes, this is how we become of one mind when we're all helping each other, loving as brothers. And he puts down those tender-hearted, be courteous. But what happens if people have a broken heart? And it's going to take time in the grief process to heal. What's going to happen is they tend to be self-centered. And it takes time to work their way out of it. I've been through that. I understand it. Everybody has their own story. Just like the little boy in school, he had his story, just like the people at the grocery store, the ones on the highway. Every one of them has their own story as to what's going on behind the scenes in their lives. And they're each at some stage of that process. But it's our job to be loving, to be compassionate, tenderhearted, and courteous for them in order to help them reach their goals. And one way to do that, then, is to stir up love, and that will produce good works. Because then it'll be obvious. If we can consider one another to stir up love and good works, make good things happen, reach outside beyond ourselves. And I must say, this congregation has been probably the most marvelous experience in life of people who are gathered together, loving as brothers, one mind, tender-hearted, courteous, and stirring up each other to good works. It has been my privilege to be with you. So we know the healing steps. We know that the healing steps are physical, and what we do and what we consume, or what we avoid in both doing and consuming. We know the mental diet is critical, what we put into our minds and what we avoid putting in. And we know the spiritual diet. We know that we are to acquire some things and avoid others. And that God will give us the spirit, not of fear, but of power, of love, and a sound mind, as we read in 2 Timothy 1:7. And if we take these tools, we can step forward each day at a time, regardless of the circumstance in our own lives, but we can use these to not just help ourselves, but to reach out to the world around us, to whom we might otherwise be oblivious to, that they might be able to have a healed, broken heart as well.